The ground was the first thing. I'd pulled off Highway 285 just south of Fort Stockton. Same spot I'd used maybe a dozen times. And when I stepped down from the cab, my boots hit something that didn't feel right. Too flat. Too even. The whole pull-off was level as a poured slab, and out in the middle of nowhere that doesn't happen by accident. Desert ground has dips and rocks and mesquite roots pushing through. This was smooth, like somebody had graded it and then just left it. But I was tired. I'd been running since El Paso and my hours were up, so I wasn't about to keep driving just because the parking spot felt weird. I locked the doors, cracked the sleeper vent, and settled in. That radio on my dash, the old transistor one, it doesn't actually work. Hasn't in years. But it has this little amber dial light that still comes on when I run power through it, and I keep it there because that glow is about the only thing in the cab that feels like company on a dark stretch. I set my logbook on the passenger seat, pulled off my boots, and listened to the desert go quiet. The air coming through the vent tasted like sage and something mineral, like crushed rock, and I could feel the grit between my teeth. Way off in the distance, the low hum of tires on the highway, barely there, more like a sound you feel than one you hear. I was almost under when the thudding started. I want to say right off that I almost didn't open my eyes. I'd been drifting, that heavy place right before sleep takes you, and my first thought was the tarp on the trailer catching wind. High desert does that. You get these gusts that come out of nowhere and snap everything around. I told myself that's what it was. Loose tarp, sudden gust, metal flexing. But the rhythm was wrong. A flapping tarp is irregular. This was deliberate. Thud, 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 like somebody testing the sleeper cab door with the flat of their hand, seeing how much give was in the metal. I sat up, told myself it was nothing, told myself that a second time for good measure. The thudding stopped, and what replaced it was worse. A thin, metallic scrape running along the passenger door. Not random, following the lock mechanism. Somebody dragging a blade along the seam where the door latches, feeling for the catch. Now, anyone who's been driving long enough has heard weird sounds at rest stops. Raccoons on the steps, wind in the wheel wells. You build a catalog of noises in your head and you file everything into it. But I didn't have a slot for this one. This was the sound of a pocket knife on a lock, and there's no animal in Texas that makes that sound. I reached up and killed the dash lights. The amber glow from the radio went with them, and the cab went black. I want to tell you, that was the moment the whole thing shifted. Because when that little light went out, I couldn't see a thing, and suddenly the sounds got louder. The scrape had stopped. Now there was weight against the glass. Pressure. Somebody leaning their whole body into the passenger window. I moved the curtain maybe half an inch. Just a sliver. There was a man. A silhouette, really pressed up against the glass. He wasn't looking in. He was running his hands along the door frame, top to bottom, systematically. Not frantic. Not drunk. Methodical. The way you'd check a truck if you were trying to figure out how to get inside it without making noise. I was sitting there in the dark thinking, he hasn't seen me. The lights are off, the curtains mostly closed, he doesn't know I'm in here. If I stay still, he'll move on. That was my reasoning, and I'll be honest with you, I still don't know if that was the smart play or the one that almost got me killed. I sat there with my hands on my knees and I waited. The scraping stopped again. I heard something heavier. Metal on metal, but a different sound. A clinking like chain links being pulled from a jacket pocket. I peeked through the curtain again, and he was draping a chain over the passenger door handle, looping it around, getting a grip. And then he started humming. I don't mean whistling. I don't mean singing. A low, dissonant hum that came through the truck frame more than through the air. I could feel it in the seat beneath me. And right at that moment, the amber dial light on my radio flickered once and died. Not the dash lights, which I'd already killed. The radio light. The one thing in the cab I could still see by. Gone. Total black. He knew I was in there. I understood that suddenly and completely, the way you understand something before you can explain it. The humming wasn't for himself. It was for me. He was letting me know. My hand was on the ignition. The problem with a truck starter is that it's loud and it takes a second. You turn that key and the whole frame shakes before the engine catches, and in that second, Whoever is outside has a window to do whatever they're going to do. I sat there with my hand on the key and I thought about the chain on the handle and the knife on the lock and the fact that I'd been sitting in this cab for the last 5 minutes hoping he'd just go away. I turned the key. The engine caught hard, the whole cab jolting, and I heard him stumble. I didn't look. I slapped it into gear and stood on the throttle and the tires just spun in the gravel for a second before they grabbed. The truck lurched forward and I cranked the wheel toward the highway. That's when the mirror exploded. Something hit the driver's side mirror so hard that glass came through the open vent slot and caught me in the cheek. I flinched, swerved, and caught a glimpse in what was left of the mirror. He was standing in the middle of the pull-off. Jumpsuit, grease stains, an iron tire iron in one hand, hanging at his side. He was looking right at me, not chasing, not running, just watching me go. His mouth was open, and even at that distance, I could see he was smiling. I hit the highway and didn't let off the fuel for 20 miles. I called it in when I got to the truck stop in Fort Stockton. Sheriff's office took the report and said they'd send somebody to check the pull-off. Nobody ever called me back. I called twice. The second time, the dispatcher told me they'd found nothing out there. No vehicles, no evidence, nothing. Just the pull-off. That flat, level ground. I don't drive through that stretch of Pecos County after dark anymore without the doors chained from the inside. And every time I hear a loud bang, a tire blowout, a pallet shifting in the trailer, anything sudden and metallic, my face goes to that spot on my cheek where the glass hit. Like a piece of it is still there. The thing I keep coming back to is the lock. He was working that passenger door lock with a blade, and he was good at it. Systematic. Like he'd done it before. If I hadn't looked through the curtain when I did, if I'd stayed asleep for another minute, would he have gotten through that lock before I even knew he was there? I still think about that. The next one comes from someone who had to live with what she chose to look at. Story 2. I should start by saying I knew what I was doing. I want that to be clear before anything else, because the worst version of this story is the one where I pretend I didn't. The staging area near the port of Houston ran all hours. You'd smell the brine first, then the diesel, then your lungs would just accept it and stop noticing. Shipping containers stacked 3 high, the constant metallic clang of them being loaded and locked, and this cold sea air that came off the channel and settled on everything like a second skin. The thing about that place was the quiet between the machines. You'd see 50 trucks move through in a night, but you never heard anybody laugh. Never heard a conversation that wasn't about paperwork or fuel. Drivers kept their heads down, and that was just how it worked. You didn't ask about that silence. You just stepped into it. I'd been hauling a long time. Long enough to carry a set of brass keys on a ring from the old Dallas terminal they tore down in the 90s. I kept them because they felt right in my hand. Heavy, old, the kind of metal that warms up when you hold it. When I got nervous, I'd jingle them without thinking, and I was jingling them a lot those last few months. More than I wanted to admit. The jobs were simple. Pick up a container at the staging area, drive it to a drop-off point, hand it off or leave it at a marked location. The cargo wasn't always on the manifest. Sometimes the manifest was blank. I was paid well for not asking, and I told myself that was a reasonable arrangement. A lot of drivers do things they don't talk about. I'm not saying that makes it right. I'm saying that's how I explained it to myself at the time. The first thing I noticed was a container with a patch on it. Freshly welded, a square of metal about the size of a dinner plate, and the weld pattern didn't match. Our company had a standard repair, a specific bead, and this wasn't it. This was somebody else's work. I ran my fingers over it and it was still warm to the touch. I told myself it was a field repair, something done in transit to keep the cargo secure. That made sense. Containers take damage on the road. You patch them and you keep moving. I jingled my keys and hooked up and drove. The next run came 2 weeks later. Same type of container, same kind of route, same empty stretch of road between the port and wherever. I was doing my walk around at a stop in the middle of nowhere when I heard it. A thud from inside the trailer. Muffled, like a fist hitting metal from the inside. Not loud, not frantic, just a single, deliberate knock. I stood there with my hand on the trailer wall and I told myself it was loose equipment shifting. Pallets settle. Straps pop. Cargo slides. I'd heard 100 sounds from inside 100 trailers, and none of them had ever been anything. I got back in the cab and I drove. But I started checking after that. Every stop, I'd walk back and I'd listen. Most of the time, nothing. But sometimes that same thud. And the routes were getting more frequent. Twice a month, then 3 times. Always to places in the middle of nowhere. Empty lots out past the county roads. Fence posts with orange tape on them. Nobody at the other end. Just a place to leave the container and go. I told myself a lot of things during that stretch. I told myself the economy was bad and I was lucky to have the work. I told myself that what was in the containers wasn't my business. I told myself that asking questions would end my career, and I was too old to start over. All of that was true. None of it was enough. One night I finished a route and came back to the staging area, and there was a shoe on the loading dock. A small one. A child's shoe. Just sitting there on the concrete like somebody had stepped right out of it and kept walking. I stared at it for a long time. I told myself a driver's kid had been playing in the yard that afternoon. I told myself it fell out of a cab during a load. I told myself 4 different things and not one of them was enough, but I walked away from it. I walked away and I got in my truck and I drove home. The next morning, my supervisor called me into the office. He didn't say much. He leaned back in his chair and he looked at me and he said, "Don't look at the cargo, Hattie. Look at the road." And the way he said it, the way he held my eyes, I knew he wasn't giving me advice. He was telling me he'd seen me lingering at the trailers. He was telling me to stop. I should have stopped. I know that now. I knew it then. The difference between knowing and doing is the whole story of my life. The run that broke me was a Thursday in the fall. I'd picked up a container at the port and was headed to a drop-off outside Beaumont. The padlock on the trailer didn't catch right. It was one of those combination locks and the mechanism stuck. I had to jiggle it open to reset it, and when I did, the door swung a few inches on its own. I didn't mean to look inside. That's what I tell myself. But the door was open and the interior light had come on, and I could see the far wall. There were markings on the inside of the container wall. Small ones, hand-painted, in rows. Tally marks, but not random. Grouped in sets of 5 the way you count days. Rows and rows of them, some in different colors, some in what looked like different hands. Some of the paint was old and flaking. Some of it looked fresh. I shut the door. I locked it. I stood there in the cold with my keys in my hand, and when I dropped them, the sound of the brass hitting the pavement was the same sound as that bolt clicking open. That small, final, metallic click. I picked them up and I drove the container to the drop-off and I left it where I was supposed to leave it and I turned around and I drove home. The next morning I went to the terminal. I handed in my rig and I signed the papers. They didn't ask me why. I think they were relieved. I moved to a small place in the hill country where nobody knew me, and I've been here since. I gave the money away. All of it. I didn't want it in my house. But you can't give back the time. You can't undo the miles. I drove those containers to those places, and whatever happened after I unhooked and drove away, I was the one who got them there. I can't look at a shipping container now without counting the bolts. I keep every light in my house on until I fall asleep, and some nights I don't fall asleep. I sit in the kitchen and I listen to how quiet it is, and the quiet is the same quiet as the inside of one of those trailers. And I wonder if anybody on the other side of a wall like that is listening back. The thing I can't put down is whether they knew. The people inside those containers. Did they hear the engine, feel the turns, know that somebody was driving them, and did they think that person could have stopped it? Do they still think about me the way I think about them? I still hear that thud sometimes. Just one. In the middle of the night, when the house is quiet and the lights are on and I'm sitting there with my keys in my hand. I hear it and I can't make it be anything else. This third account is from a man who moved into a place he shouldn't have stayed in. Story 3. The house had this thing about it where the rooms didn't add up. I don't know how to explain it any better than that. You'd walk through a doorway and the room on the other side would feel smaller than the hallway you just left, even though it wasn't, not if you measured. It was like the proportions were slightly wrong in a way you couldn't name, but you could feel in your feet when you crossed the threshold. My grandfather's belt buckle. That's what I was wearing the day I moved in. This big, faded Western buckle he gave me before he passed, way too large for me, and I'd rub my thumb across the face of it when I was trying to think straight. I was doing a lot of that those first few weeks. The place was my grandfather's old ranch house outside Marfa. I'd inherited it, and I moved in because I was broke. The trucking company I'd been driving for went under and I didn't have rent money for an apartment anywhere, so the house wasn't so much a gift as a last resort. I was grateful for it. I just wasn't comfortable in it. The first thing I did was clean. The house had been empty for going on 10 years, and there was dust on everything. The air tasted like dry dust and old cedar, and the wind came through gaps in the window frames so the whole house hummed when it picked up. Dry heat, the kind that doesn't let up at night. I'd sleep with the windows open and the wind would move through the rooms like it had more right to be there than I did. I started in the guest bedroom. I pulled up the loose floorboards to check for termite damage and I found a stash. A hairbrush with long brown hair still in the bristles. A wedding ring, plain gold, a little tarnished. A pair of glasses, wire-framed, folded up neat, like somebody had set them down and meant to come back for them. Now, I figured that was normal. Old houses collect things. People live in them, they leave stuff behind, it falls through the boards. The ring bothered me for a second because you don't usually forget your wedding ring, but I set it on the kitchen counter and I moved on. People lose things. Moving is a messy process. I'd moved enough times to know that. A week later, I was cleaning out the kitchen vent and I found a watch. Men's watch, still running. That was strange, but I told myself it was a quartz movement. Those things run for years on a battery. A few days after that, I pulled up the corner of the rug in the living room and there was a driver's license underneath it. Then a set of keys turned up in the medicine cabinet, sitting on the shelf behind the ibuprofen like they'd been placed there on purpose. Each time I found something, I'd set it aside and think, okay, this is just stuff. This is just a house that's been lived in by a lot of people over a lot of years. But the things were too personal. You don't lose your driver's license under a rug and just leave. You don't tuck a ticking watch inside a kitchen vent. And the items were in good shape. Not dusty, not decayed. Like they'd been put there recently. I'm probably talking the place down a little for the purposes of the story, but it was genuinely uncomfortable. I stopped sleeping in the master bedroom because the ceiling felt lower at night, like the walls were leaning in. I moved my mattress to the kitchen and kept the overhead light on and started spending all my time there, like it was the one room I could trust. The thing that broke the explanation was the dates. I looked at the driver's license I'd found under the rug and it was valid. Not expired. Not 10 years old. The issue date was within the last 5 years. And the house had been empty for 10. So either somebody had been coming into this house while it was supposedly vacant, or the license wasn't what I thought it was. I started mapping where I'd found things. I got a piece of paper and I drew a rough floor plan and I marked each spot. Hairbrush in the guest bedroom floorboards. Watch in the kitchen vent. License under the living room rug. Keys in the medicine cabinet. Glasses back in the guest bedroom. The wedding ring originally from the guest bedroom too. When I connected the marks, they made a line. Not a scatter, not random. A line, running from the guest bedroom through the kitchen and into the den, toward one specific section of wall. I stood in front of that wall and I tapped it. Hollow. Every other wall in the house was solid. This one sounded like there was a space behind it. And there was a sound. Faint, rhythmic, ticking. Not mechanical, not like a clock. More like a pulse. Something behind the wall, keeping time with itself. I moved the bookshelf that was standing in front of it. Heavy thing, old oak. Took me a good 20 minutes to budge it by myself. Behind it was a door. Not a panel, not a drywall patch. A door with a handle set into the wall like it had always been there. It wasn't on the blueprints. I'd looked at the blueprints when I inherited the place, trying to figure out the wiring, and there was no door on that wall. I didn't open it. I stood there with my hand on my belt buckle, rubbing the metal with my thumb, and I listened to that ticking, and I pulled the driver's license out of my back pocket. I looked at the photo. The face looking back at me was a man I'd never seen before. Clear photo, middle-aged, unremarkable face. But the name on the license was my name. Bram Foster. My name, spelled exactly right, on a license belonging to a man who wasn't me. I found out later, when I looked it up on my phone, that a man by that name, the man in the photo, had been reported missing in Presidio County 6 months before I moved in. The ticking stopped. Right when I picked up the license, right when I looked at the name. The wall went quiet, and it stayed quiet. I packed my truck with what I could carry in one trip. Clothes, my laptop, the dog. I left everything else. The furniture, the dishes, my grandfather's things, all of it. I pulled out of the driveway and I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I sold the property the next week to a developer out of El Paso for practically nothing. I never went back. I live in a one-bedroom apartment in a new building now, and the thing I like about it is that the walls are thin enough that I can hear my neighbor's television through them. I know what's behind every wall in this place. Insulation, wiring, nothing else. I made sure. I think about that hidden door more than I think about anything else in my life. I think about what was on the other side of it. I think about the fact that I walked away without opening it, and I don't know if that was the smartest decision I've ever made or the most cowardly. I think about the man in the photo, the one who went missing, and I think about whether he found that door and whether he opened it. Was the house just collecting those objects, pulling them in the way old places do? Or was somebody putting them there one at a time over years, building that line toward the wall, placing a license with my name on it where they knew I'd find it? And if somebody was doing that, what did they want me to do when I finally reached the end of the line? I still have the license. I keep it in a drawer in the kitchen. Sometimes I open the drawer and I look at it, my name on somebody else's face, and I still can't make it sit right. Story 4. The light for room 204 was blinking on the console and the phone was making that sound it makes when somebody's on the line but not talking. Not dead air. Breathing. Heavy, deliberate, in and out like somebody who'd been running and was trying to get their wind back. I stared at the console. Room 204. I checked that room out myself at the start of my shift. I'd walked the key card back to the drawer myself. There was nobody in 204. There couldn't be anybody in 204. The breathing went on for maybe 30 seconds. Then the line went dead. Let me back up. My name is Jace. I was 22 and I'd been night manager at a motel off I-10 near Van Horn for all of 3 days. It was the kind of place that smelled like stale bleach and whatever heavy industrial cleaner they used on the carpets, a smell that got into your clothes by the end of a shift. The ice machine down the hall clicked every 10 minutes. This rhythmic mechanical knock that I'd already started timing my patrols around. Cold, artificial air blowing through vents that never quite shut off. Every room was laid out the same furniture, same bedspread, same lamp on the same nightstand. But the paintings on the walls, these generic desert landscape prints, they were all hung slightly crooked. Every single one. Not the same direction either. Each one tilted a different way, like somebody had hung them all in a hurry or on purpose. I'd straightened 3 of them on my first night, and by the second, they were crooked again. I kept a laminated photo of my golden retriever, Gus, in my wallet. My mom gave it to me before I took the job, said to look at it whenever I felt weird being alone. I looked at it a lot. 3 nights in, and I was already pulling it out every couple hours. Earlier that evening, before any of this started, I'd seen a man standing near the vending machines by the lobby. Tan jacket, average build, just standing there with his hands in his pockets. I figured he was a guest getting a soda or waiting for somebody. He didn't come to the desk. He didn't check in. I went out to stock the ice, and when I came back he was gone. I didn't think about it again until the phone rang. So the light is blinking and the line is dead, and I'm standing behind the front desk at 2 in the morning with the console lit up in front of me. I pulled out the key cards for 204 from the drawer. They were right there. Both of them. Nobody had checked out a card for that room. I called the room. It rang and rang. No answer. Now, I know what you're thinking. System glitch. The digital reservation system we used was old, and it had a habit of showing rooms as vacant when they were occupied or vice versa. The owner had mentioned it during my training, which lasted about 40 minutes. I told myself that's what this was. A glitch. A phantom call from a room the system thought was active but wasn't. I picked up the flashlight and I walked to the second floor. The hallway was dark. I mean really dark. The overhead fluorescents were on a timer and they'd gone to half power after midnight, which meant the hallway was this dim, yellowish strip of light with the dark pressing in from both sides. My flashlight cut through it, and all I could hear was my own footsteps on the carpet and the ice machine, 3 floors below, still clicking. The door to 204 was ajar. Not open, not closed. Ajar. Maybe an inch. I pushed it open with the flashlight. The room was empty. Bed made, towels folded. Nobody there. But the television was on. Not just on. Blaring. The volume was at maximum. This wall of sound filling the room. Some late-night infomercial with a woman talking about cookware. I could feel it in my chest. I went in. I reached for the remote on the nightstand to kill the volume, and that's when I saw the notebook. It was a composition notebook, the black and white marbled kind, sitting open on the nightstand. I picked it up. The pages were filled with handwriting, small and neat, written in blue ink. I read the first line. Night manager arrives at 10:02 p.m. Locks front door. Walks perimeter at 10:15, 11:30, and 1 a.m. I flipped the page. Parks silver Tacoma near the dumpster. Enters through side door. Checks the key drawer at 10:05 and again at 12:45. There were entries for every night I'd worked. 3 nights. Exact times. My exact movements. Where I parked, which door I used, when I walked the perimeter, how long I stayed at the desk between patrols. Everything. The ice machine stopped. That sound that had been constant since I'd started, that click every 10 minutes, it just stopped. The building went quiet. No hum, no rattle of the compressor. Nothing. Just the television and my breathing and this absolute, unnatural silence from the hallway. I put the notebook down and I turned around. The man in the tan jacket was standing in the bathroom doorway. He had a pen in his hand, one of those cheap ballpoint ones, and he was looking at me. Not angry. Not scared. His face was blank. Completely, absolutely blank. The way a face looks when there's nothing behind it that it wants to show you. He didn't say anything. I didn't say anything. We stood there for maybe 5 seconds, and I want to tell you that I had a plan, but I didn't. What I had was a fire extinguisher in the hallway behind me and 3 days of training that had covered check-in procedures and laundry schedules and exactly nothing about what to do when you find a stranger in a room that was supposed to be empty. I stepped back into the hallway. I grabbed the fire extinguisher off the wall and I held it in front of me with both hands and I said, "You need to leave. Right now." He looked at me. He looked at the extinguisher. And he sighed, like a teacher who's tired of explaining the same thing. This long, bored exhale, and he walked past me into the hallway and down the stairs and out the side door. I watched him go. I watched him walk across the parking lot and into the dark beyond the reach of the lights. And I noticed his hands. They were stained. Dark blue, all over his fingers and his palms. The same blue as the ink in the notebook. The same blue as the handwriting that described every move I'd made for the last 3 nights. I locked the side door. I locked the front door. I went back behind the desk and I sat on the floor and I called the police. I stayed behind that desk until they showed up, and I didn't open the door until I saw the uniforms. They searched the motel. They found nothing in 204 but the notebook. They took it. They asked me if I knew the man. I said no. They asked me if anything was missing. I said I didn't know. I'd only been there 3 days. I quit the next morning. I packed my stuff and I drove back to my parents' house, and I haven't worked a night shift since. I checked the locks on the front door 5 times before I go to bed. Not twice, not 3 times. 5. I count them out. The thing that doesn't fit, the thing I can't get past, is the notebook. The entries went back a full week before my first shift. 7 days of notes describing a night manager's routine at that motel, the exact patrol schedule, the exact door used, the exact parking spot. But I'd only started working there 3 days before I found it. The notebook was documenting me before I existed in that building. So who was it describing and where did they go? I never got an answer. The police took the notebook and I never heard back. I called once, 2 weeks later, and the detective told me there was nothing to follow up on. No name, no prints they could match, no complaint from a previous employee. Just a notebook full of blue ink and a room that was supposed to be empty. This last story is the one I keep coming back to. It's from a woman who went looking for quiet and found something else. Story 5. I go back to that day more than I'd like to admit. Not the scary part. The part before. The part where I still thought the woods were mine. I worked as a forestry contractor in the Big Thicket National Preserve in Hardin County. Mostly invasive species removal, trail assessment, that kind of thing. Alone most of the time. Just me and the equipment and whatever section they'd assigned me for the week. After my sister passed, the solitude was the only thing that didn't feel like it was asking me questions. The woods didn't need anything from me. They just let me be there. I kept a dried wildflower in the visor of my truck. A little blue one, pressed flat, from the last road trip my sister and I took together before she got sick. I don't know why I kept it there instead of in a book or a frame. I think I just wanted it where I'd see it every day without having to look for it. Every time I flipped the visor down, there it was. I'd touch it, just the edge of one petal, and then I'd flip it back up and drive. The spot I'd been assigned that week was a logging trail that hadn't been maintained in years. Overgrown, the trail barely visible under the new growth. The air was thick, humid, the kind of heavy that makes your shirt stick to your back before you've done anything. The smell was damp pine needles and rotting wood. That sweet, dark smell of the forest floor breaking down. Crickets everywhere, and somewhere off in the distance, the sound of water moving, a creek or a bayou. But no birds. That was the thing I noticed but didn't think about until later. No birdsong. In a place like the Big Thicket in the fall, the birds should have been everywhere. It was dead quiet except for the insects and the water. I'd been working the trail for about 2 hours when I saw the truck. It was parked maybe 100 yards off the trail, tucked under a canopy of pines where you'd never see it from the road. White pickup, older model, dented rear fender. I recognized it because I'd seen it before. A year ago, I'd reported the owner for illegal dumping in a different section of the preserve. I'd found his truck near a pile of construction waste he'd shoveled out of his bed into a ravine. I took photos, I sent them in, and I was told later that he'd been fined. Nothing major. A slap on the wrist. And now here he was again, deep in a part of the woods where no truck had any business being. I told myself he was scouting for a new dump spot. That was the reasonable explanation. He'd been caught once, he'd learned to go further off the grid, and I was just being paranoid because I was the one who'd turned him in. I almost let it go. I almost turned around and went back to my section and called it in from the truck later. But I didn't. I parked my truck on the trail and I walked toward his. I was going to get close enough to read the plate, take a photo, and leave. That was the plan. Get the evidence, get out, call the ranger station. I got about 30 feet from his truck when he came out of the trees. He didn't come from the direction of his vehicle. He came from the side, from the undergrowth, like he'd been watching me approach and had circled around. He was carrying a heavy metal pipe, one of the thick ones like a piece of rebar or a crowbar. And he wasn't looking at me the way you look at somebody you're surprised to see. He was looking at me the way you look at something you've been waiting for. He started walking toward me. Not running. Walking. Steady, deliberate, the pipe hanging at his side. My body figured it out before my head did. My legs went stiff. My hands closed up. I couldn't feel my fingers. I took a step back. Then another, and I was trying to think, trying to run through what I was supposed to do. And all I could think was, I'm alone out here. Nobody knows where I am. My truck is a quarter-mile down the trail. I'm not going to make it. He was maybe 20 feet away when the helicopter came over. The sound hit first, this deep thumping of rotors, and then the search and rescue bird broke through the tree line maybe 200 feet up, banking hard, flying low. It was loud enough that the air vibrated. He stopped. He looked up at the helicopter, and then he looked at me, and then he turned and walked back into the brush. Just like that. Turned around and disappeared into the thicket. I stood there for a long time. A full minute, maybe 2. The helicopter banked again and moved off toward the east, the sound of it fading until it was just the crickets again. I let out a breath that I think I'd been holding since I first saw him. My hands were shaking. I pressed them against my legs to make them stop, and they wouldn't. I told myself it was over. He was gone. The helicopter had spooked him, and he was gone, and I was going to walk back to my truck, and I was going to drive out of here, and I was never coming back to this section. The sound of the helicopter was almost gone now, just a faint pulse in the distance, fading into the hum of the crickets. The quiet came back into the woods, and I started walking toward my truck. I came around the bend in the trail, and I saw my truck, and I stopped. All 4 tires were flat. Not just low. Flat. Slashed. The sidewalls cut open, the rubber peeling back. And on the hood, scratched into the paint with something sharp, were marks. Not words. Just marks. Like tally marks, or like something had been dragged across the metal over and over. He hadn't been scared off by the helicopter. He hadn't run. He'd used the sound, the distraction, to get ahead of me. While I was standing there shaking and telling myself it was over, he'd gone to my truck and he'd taken it apart. He'd been setting this up the whole time. The pipe, the walking toward me, all of it was to get me away from my vehicle so he could do this. The woods were quiet again. No helicopter. No birds. Just the crickets and the water and whatever else was in the trees with me. I didn't go to the truck. I turned and I walked into the thicket, off the trail, into the densest brush I could find. I found a spot between 2 fallen pines where I could press myself down into the needles and the rot and the damp, and I got as small as I could and I stayed there. He came back to the truck. I could hear him. Footsteps on the trail, slow, and then the sound of him pacing around my vehicle. Back and forth. He was waiting. He'd cut my tires and he was waiting for me to come back. Because where else was I going to go? That's what he was counting on. That I'd come back to the truck because that's what people do. They go back to the thing that's broken and they try to fix it. I stayed in the pine needles for hours. I don't know how long. The light changed. The crickets never stopped. He paced and then he'd go quiet and then he'd pace again. At one point I heard him kick the side of my truck. Just once, a hard metallic bang that went through the trees. When the sky started to get light, I could see through the branches. Gray turning to pink. I hadn't moved in hours. My legs were numb. My shirt was soaked through, and the cold had gotten into my bones even though it was still warm out. He was still there, standing by the driver's side door, the pipe resting against his shoulder. Then something happened off to the north, a sound, maybe a branch falling, maybe an animal, and he turned toward it. He walked a few steps in that direction, his head tilted, listening. I got up. I didn't think about it. My legs moved and I was up and I was running, not on the trail but through the brush, through the briars and the low branches and the standing water, just running. I don't know how far it was. 3 miles, maybe more. By the time I broke out onto the main road, my arms were cut up and my boots were full of water and I couldn't feel my feet. A patrol car was coming down the road. I stepped out into it. I waved both arms and the car stopped and I went to my knees in the gravel. I don't remember what I said to the deputy. I think I just kept saying, "He's in the woods, he's in the woods." They went in. They found my truck. They found his truck too, but it was empty. He was gone. They took a report. They told me they'd increase patrols in the area. I never heard anything else. I don't go into the woods anymore. Not for work, not for anything. I can't. The grief I carried in for my sister, the quiet I was looking for, it's not there anymore. It got replaced by something else. Something cold and specific. I keep the curtains drawn at home. I check the windows before it gets dark. And every time I hear a helicopter, I think about that moment where I let myself believe it was over, and how wrong I was. I think about the marks on the hood of my truck. Not words, just marks. Like he was counting something, or keeping a record. I don't know if he came after me because of the report I filed a year ago, or if I walked into something that had nothing to do with me at all. I think about the way he came out of the trees, not from his truck but from the side, like he'd been watching me the whole time I was walking toward him, like he'd seen me before I saw him, like he'd been out there in the quiet woods, in the space where there were no birds, waiting for someone to come down that trail. And I was the one who did. I still have the wildflower in my visor. I can't bring myself to move it. But I can't look at it the same way either, because every time I flip that visor down, I think about that day, and I think about what was waiting in the woods, and I wonder if he ever went back.